Jomo Kenyatta was born Kamau to parents Moigoy and Wamboy. His father was the chief of a small agricultural village in Gatundu Division, Kiambu District, one of 5 administrative districts in the Central Highlands of British East Africa, now Kenya. Moigoy died when Kamau was very young, and he was, as custom dictated, adopted by his uncle Njengai to become Kamau W. Njengai. Njengai also took over the chiefdom and Moigoy's wife Wamboy. When his mother died giving birth to a boy, James Moigoy, Kamau moved to live with his grandfather, Kungu Mangana, who was a noted medicine man too in the area. Around the age of 10, suffering from an infection, Kamau was taken to the Church of Scotland mission at Dagato, about 19 kilometers north of Nairobi, where surgery was successfully carried out on both feet and one leg. Kamau was impressed by his first exposure to Europeans, and determined to join the mission school. He ran away from home to become a resident pupil at the mission, studying amongst other subjects, the Bible, English, mathematics, and carpentry. He paid the school fees by working as a houseboy and cook for a nearby white settler. In 1912, having completed his mission school education, Kamau became an apprentice carpenter. The following year he underwent initiation ceremonies, including circumcision. In August 1914 Kamau was baptized at the Church of Scotland mission, initially taking the name John Peter Kamau, but swiftly changing it to Johnson Kamau. He then departed the mission for Nairobi to seek employment. Initially he worked as an apprentice carpenter on a sisal, an agave used for agricultural twine, farm in Thika, under the tutelage of John Cook, who had been in charge of the building program at Dagato. As World War I progressed, able-bodied Kikuyu were forced into work by the British authorities. To avoid this, Kamau moved to Narok, living amongst the Maasai, where he worked as a clerk for an Asian contractor. It was around this time that he took to wearing a traditional beaded belt known as a Kenyatta, a Swahili word which means light of Kenya. In 1919 he met and married his first wife Grace Wahu, according to Kikuyu tradition. When it became apparent that Grace was pregnant, his church elders ordered him to get married before a European magistrate, and undertake the appropriate church rites. The civil ceremony only took place in November 1922. On November 20, 1920 Kamau's first son, Peter Muigai, was born. Amongst other jobs he undertook during this period, Kamau served as an interpreter in the Nairobi High Court, and ran a store out of his Dagoretti, an area of Nairobi, home. In 1922 Kamau adopted the name Jomo, a Kikuyu name meaning burning spear, Kenyatta, and began working for the Nairobi Municipal Council Public Works Department, once again under John Cook, who was the water superintendent, as a store clerk and water meter reader. It was also the start of his political career. The previous year Harry Thuku, a well-educated and respected Kikuyu, had formed the East African Association, EAA, to campaign for the return of Kikuyu lands given over to white settlers when the country became the British Crown Colony of Kenya in 1920. Kenyatta joined the EAA in 1922. In 1925 the EAA disbanded under governmental pressure, but its members came together again as the Kikuyu Central Association, KCA, formed by James Buta and Joseph Kangeth. Kenyatta worked as editor of the KCA's journal between 1924 and 1929, and by 1928 he had become the KCA's general secretary, having given up his job with the municipality to make time. In May 1928 Kenyatta launched a monthly Kikuyu language newspaper called Mwigwithania, Kikuyu word meaning he who brings together, which was intended to draw all sections of the Kikuyu together. The paper, supported by an Asian-owned printing press, had a mild and unassuming tone, and was tolerated by the British authorities. Worried about the future of its East African territories, the British government began toying with the idea of forming a union of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanganyika. Whilst this was fully supported by white settlers in the Central Highlands, it would be disastrous to Kikuyu interests. It was believed that the settlers would be given self-government, and that the rights of the Kikuyu would be ignored. In February 1929 Kenyatta was dispatched to London to represent the KCA in discussions with the Colonial Office, but the Secretary of State for the Colonies refused to meet him. Undeterred, Kenyatta wrote several letters to British papers, including The Times. Kenyatta's letter published in The Times in March 1930 set out 5 points. The security of land tenure and the demand for land taken by European settlers to be returned. Improved educational opportunities for black Africans. The repeal of hut and poll taxes. Representation for black Africans in the Legislative Council. Freedom to pursue traditional customs, such as female genital mutilation. His letter concluded by saying that a failure to satisfy these points must inevitably result in a dangerous explosion, the one thing all sane men with to avoid. He returned to Kenya on September 24, 1930, landing at Mombasa. He had failed on his quest for all except one point, the right to develop independent educational institutions for black Africans. Kenyatta had achieved a goal with the move to independent African educational institutions, although they were still opposed by the colonial authorities. He had also set in motion the pattern for his future opposition to colonialism. In May 1931 Kenyatta once again left Kenya for London, to represent the KCA before a parliamentary commission on the closer union of East Africa, and once again he was ignored, this time despite the backing of Liberals in the House of Commons. In the end the British government abandoned its plan for such a union. Kenyatta headed north, to Birmingham, and enrolled at a college for a year. Kenyatta would stay away from Kenya for the next 15 years. Having completed his course in Birmingham, Kenyatta returned to London and, in June 1932, he testified to the Morris Carter Kenya Land Commission on behalf of Kikuyu land claims. The report, which was not published until 1934, resulted in some of the appropriated territories being returned to the Kikuyu, but in general the White Highlands policy of the colonial administration was maintained, restricting the Kikuyu to reservations. In August 1932 Kenyatta, who had joined the Communist Party, traveled to Moscow to study economics at the Moscow State University, under the sponsorship of the Caribbean Pan-Africanist George Padmore. His stay came to an end when Padmore fell out of favor with the Soviets. Back in London he met up with other black nationalists and Pan-Africanists, and even protested against the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1936. In 1934 Kenyatta began his studies at University College, London, working on Arthur Ruffel Barlow's English Kikuyu Dictionary. The following year he transferred to the London School of Economics, to study social anthropology under the renowned Polish anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski. Malinowski was a significant influence in Kenyatta's life as world-leading ethnographer, and the creator of the social anthropological field known as functionalism, that a culture's ceremonies and rituals have logic and function within the culture. Malinowski steered Kenyatta in his thesis on Kikuyu culture and tradition. Kenyatta published a revised version of his thesis as Facing Mount Kenya in 1938. Facing Mount Kenya remains an important, even classic, work for its insights into the traditions of Kikuyu culture, written in a form which proved accessible to readers in the West. Kenyatta's assertion of the strong values inherent in Kikuyu society is not, however, without its controversies, in particular Kenyatta's firm approval for the practice of female circumcision, which he claimed was so fundamental to Kikuyu culture that to end it, as colonial authorities and missionaries back in Kenya wished to do, would damage the culture as a whole. Effectively cut off in Britain from the KCA, which had been banned back in Kenya, by World War II, Kenyatta continued to campaign for Kikuyu rights, publishing several books and pamphlets, including a study of the Kikuyu language. Kenyatta supported himself, and avoided being conscripted, by working as a farm laborer and lecturing for the Workers' Educational Association. He was even an extra in Alexander Korda film Sanders of the River, 1943. In May 1942 he married for the second time, to an English governess, Edna Clark. Kenyatta's second son, Peter Magana, was born in August 1942. As the war progressed, Kenyatta became involved with a group of anti-colonial and African nationalists from around the African continent and the diaspora. Dr. Hastings Bunda, the future president of Malawi, was stranded in London by World War II, and his house became a regular meeting place for Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana, novelist Peter Abrahams, South African, journalist Isaac Wallace Johnson, Sierra Leone, Harry Mwangankubula, Northern Rhodesia, as well as George Padmore and C.L.R. James from the Caribbean. Together they formed the Pan-African Federation. Webb Du Bois had organized the first Pan-African Congress held in Paris in 1919, an earlier Congress in London in 1900 did not use the title Pan-African, and further congresses were held in 1921, 1923, and 1927. In London, in October 1945, Padmore and Nkrumah arranged for the fifth, and final, Congress to be held in Manchester. They also formally created the Pan-African Federation the following year. 90 delegates attended, roughly a third from Africa, a third from the West Indies, and a third from British institutions and organizations. Webb Du Bois, at the grand age of 77, was the chair. The Congress discussed plans for nationalist movements across the continent of Africa, demanded independence from colonial rule, and ends to racial discrimination, and set the groundwork for African unity. It was all but completely ignored by the international press. Kenyatta returned to Kenya in September 1946, abandoning his British wife Edna. Kenyatta married, once more, to Grace Wanjiku, who died in childbirth in 1950, and he took up the post of principal at the Kenya Teachers College in Githunguri. He was also invited to lead the newly formed Kenya African Union, KAU, of which he became president in 1947. Over the next few years Kenyatta traveled around Kenya giving lectures and campaigning for independence. In September 1951 he married his fourth wife, Ngina Muhoho. The Kenyan Crown Colony was still dominated by white settler interests, and the dangerous explosion he had predicted in the Times in 1930 became a reality. The Mau Mau Rebellion. Seen as a subversive from his call for independence and support for nationalism, Kenyatta was implicated in the Mau Mau movement by the British authorities, and on October 21, 1952 he was arrested. The trial, which lasted several months, was a travesty. Witnesses perjured themselves, and the judge was openly hostile to Kenyatta. The trial achieved worldwide publicity, despite the colonial authorities trying to claim it was simply a criminal matter. On April 8, 1953 Kenyatta was sentenced to 7 managing the Mau Mau, allegedly. The trial, which lasted several months, was a travesty. Witnesses perjured themselves, and the judge was openly hostile to Kenyatta. The trial achieved worldwide publicity, despite the colonial authorities trying to claim it was simply a criminal matter. On April 8, 1953 Kenyatta was sentenced to 7 years hard labor for managing the Mau Mau terrorist organization. He spent the next 6 years at Lokitaung before being moved to permanent restriction at Lodwar, a particularly remote desert army post, on April 14, 1959. The Mau Mau rebellion had been crushed by the British Army, and the state of emergency was lifted on November 10. During Kenyatta's incarceration the mantle of nationalist leadership had been taken up by Tom Mboya, a Luo, and Oginga Odinga, a Luo chief. Under their guidance, KAU merged with the Kenya independent movement to form a new party, the Kenya African National Union or KANU, on June 11, 1960. The Kenya African Democratic Union, KADU, was formed in opposition, representing the Maasai, Samburu, Kalenjin, and Turkana. Kenyatta's 15-year stay away from Kenya had proved beneficial. He was seen by much of the black population of Kenya as the one person who was free from the ethnic bias and factional infighting of the new political parties. Mboya and Odinga arranged for his election as president of KANU in absentia. He was still under house arrest, and campaigned for his release. On August 21, 1961 Kenyatta was finally released, on the condition that he didn't run for public office. By 1960 the British government had conceded the principle of one man one vote for Kenya, and in 1962 Kenyatta went to the Lancaster Conference in London to negotiate the terms of Kenya's independence. In May 1963 KANU won the pre-independence election and formed a provisional government. When independence was achieved on December 12 that year, Kenyatta was Prime Minister. Exactly 1 year later, with the proclamation of a republic, Kenyatta became Kenya's first president. Although he initially appealed to all sectors of Kenya's population, appointing members of government from various ethnic groups, he did this more to avoid the development of an ethnically based opposition. But the central core of his government was strongly Kikuyu in makeup. KADU merged with KANU on November 10, 1964. Kenya was now effectively a one-party state with Kenyatta in charge. Kenyatta also sought to gain the trust of the white settlers of the Central Highlands. He outlined a program of conciliation, asking them not to flee from the country but to stay and help make it an economic and social success. His slogan for these early years of his presidency was Harambee, a Swahili word which means let's all pull together. Kenyatta also rejected calls by African socialists to nationalist property, following a pro-Western, capitalist approach instead. Amongst those alienated by his policies was his first vice president Oginga Odinga. But Odinga, and the rest, soon discovered that under Kenyatta's smooth facade was a politician of stern resolve. He brooked no opposition, and over the years several of his critics died under mysterious circumstances, and a few of his political opponents were arrested and detained without trial. Increasingly isolated, Odinga left KANU to form a left-wing opposition party, the Kenya People's Union or KPU, in 1966. But by 1969 the party had been outlawed and Odinga and several other prominent members were in detention. 1969 also saw the assassination of Tom Mboya, a loyal ally of Kenyatta's, who some believed was being groomed as his successor. His murder, on July 5, sent shockwaves through the nation and led to tension and violence between the Luo and Kikuyu. Kenyatta's position was, however, unaffected, and he was re-elected for a second presidential term at the end of the year. By 1974, riding on a decade of high economic growth based on exports of cash crops and financial aid from the West, Kenyatta won a third presidential term. He was, however, the only candidate. But the cracks were starting to appear. Kenyatta's family and political friends had gained considerable wealth at the expense of the average Kenyan. And the Kikuyu were openly acting as elite, especially a small clique known as the Kiambu Mafia who had greatly benefited from land redistribution in the early days of Kenyatta's presidency. Since 1967, Kenyatta's vice president had been Daniel Arap Moi, a Kalenjin, the collective name for several small ethnic groups who were mainly settled in the Rift Valley. When Kenyatta suffered his second heart attack in 1977, his first was in 1966, the Kiambu Mafia became worried. According to the constitution, when the president died the vice president would automatically take over. They, however, wanted the presidency to remain in Kikuyu hands. It is to Kenyatta's merit that he safeguarded Moi's position when a constitutional drafting group attempted to have this rule changed. Jomo Kenyatta died in his sleep on August 22, 1978. Daniel Arap Moi took office as Kenya's second president, and pledged to continue Kenyatta's good work, under a system he called Nyoyo, a Swahili word for footsteps. Kenyatta's legacy, corruption notwithstanding, was a country which had been stable both politically and economically. Kenyatta had also maintained a friendly relationship with the West, despite his treatment by the British as a suspected Mau Mau leader. Along with his written testament to the culture and traditions of the Kikuyu, Facing Mount Kenya, Kenyatta published, in 1968, a memoir of reminiscences and speeches suffering without bitterness. Jomo Kenyatta CGH, c. 1897-22 August 1978, was a Kenyan anti-colonial activist and politician who governed Kenya as its prime minister from 1963 to 1964 and then as its first president from 1964 to his death in 1978. He was the country's first president and played a significant role in the transformation of Kenya from a colony of the British Empire into an independent republic. Ideologically an African nationalist and a conservative, he led the Kenya African National Union, KANU, party from 1961 until his death. Kenyatta was born to Kikuyu farmers in Kiambu, British East Africa. Educated at a mission school, he worked in various jobs before becoming politically engaged through the Kikuyu Central Association. In 1929, he traveled to London to lobby for Kikuyu land affairs. During the 1930s, he studied at Moscow's Communist University of the Toilers of the East, University College London, and the London School of Economics. In 1938, he published an anthropological study of Kikuyu life before working as a farm laborer in Sussex during the Second World War. Influenced by his friend George Padmore, he embraced anti-colonialist and Pan-African ideas, co-organizing the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester. He returned to Kenya in 1946 and became a school principal. In 1947, he was elected president of the Kenya African Union, through which he lobbied for independence from British colonial rule, attracting widespread indigenous support but animosity from white settlers. In 1952, he was among the Kapenguria Six arrested and charged with masterminding the anti-colonial Mau Mau Uprising. Although protesting his innocence, a view shared by later historians, he was convicted. He remained imprisoned at Lokitaung until 1959 and was then exiled to Lodwar until 1961. On his release, Kenyatta became president of KANU and led the party to victory in the 1963 general election. As prime minister, he oversaw the transition of the Kenya colony into an independent republic, of which he became president in 1964. Desiring a one-party state, he transferred regional powers to his central government, suppressed political dissent, and prohibited KANU's only rival Oginga Odinga's leftist Kenya People's Union from competing in elections. He promoted reconciliation between the country's indigenous ethnic groups and its European minority, although his relations with the Kenyan Indians were strained and Kenya's army clashed with Somali separatists in the northeastern province during the Shifta War. His government pursued capitalist economic policies and the Africanization of the economy, prohibiting non-citizens from controlling key industries. Education and healthcare were expanded, while UK-funded land redistribution favored KANU loyalists and exacerbated ethnic tensions. Under Kenyatta, Kenya joined the Organization of African Unity and the Commonwealth of Nations, espousing a pro-Western and anti-communist foreign policy amid the Cold War. Kenyatta died in office and was succeeded by Daniel Arap Moi. Kenyatta's son Uhuru later also became president. Kenyatta was a controversial figure. Prior to Kenyan independence, many of its white settlers regarded him as an agitator and malcontent, although across Africa he gained widespread respect as an anti-colonialist. During his presidency, he was given the honorary title of Mzee and lauded as the father of the nation, securing support from both the black majority and the white minority with his message of reconciliation. Conversely, his rule was criticized as dictatorial, authoritarian, and neocolonial, of favoring Kikuyu over other ethnic groups, and of facilitating the growth of widespread corruption. Kenyatta was a flamboyant character, with an extroverted personality. According to Murray Brown, he liked being at the center of life, and was always a rebel at heart who enjoyed earthly pleasures. One of Kenyatta's fellow LSE students, Elspeth Huxley, referred to him as a showman to his fingertips, jovial, a good companion, shrewd, fluent, quick, devious, subtle, and fleshpot-loving. Kenyatta liked to dress elaborately. Throughout most of his adult life, he wore finger rings, and while studying at university in London took to wearing a fez and cloak and carrying a silver-topped black cane. He adopted his surname, Kenyatta, after the name of a beaded belt he often wore in early life. As president he collected a variety of expensive cars. Murray Brown noted that Kenyatta had the ability to appear all things to all men, also displaying a consummate ability to keep his true purposes and abilities to himself, for instance concealing his connections with communists and the Soviet Union both from members of the British Labour Party and from Kikuyu figures at home. This deviousness was sometimes interpreted as dishonesty by those who met him. Referring to Kenyatta's appearance in 1920s Kenya, Murray Brown stated the leader presented himself to Europeans as an agreeable if somewhat seedy Europeanized native and to indigenous Africans as a sophisticated man about town about whose political earnestness they had certain reservations. Simon Gikandi argued that Kenyatta, like some of his contemporaries in the Pan-African movement, was an Afro-Victorian, someone whose identity had been shaped by the culture of colonialism and colonial institutions, especially those of the Victorian era. During the 1920s and 1930s, Kenyatta cultivated the image of a colonial gentleman. In England, he displayed pleasant manners and a flexible attitude in adapting to urban situations dissimilar to the lands he had grown up in. A.R. Barlow, a member of the Church of Scotland mission at Kikuyu, met with Kenyatta in Britain, later relating that he was impressed by how Kenyatta could mix on equal terms with Europeans and to hold his end up in spite of his handicaps, educationally and socially. The South African Peter Abrahams met Kenyatta in London, noting that of all the black men involved in the city's Pan-Africanist movement, he was the most relaxed, sophisticated and westernized of the lot of us. As president, Kenyatta often reminisced nostalgically about his time in England, referring to it as home on several occasions. Berman and Lonsdale described his life as being preoccupied with a search for the reconciliation of the Western modernity he embraced and an equally valued Kikuyuness he could not discard. Gikandi argued that Kenyatta's identification with Englishness was much more profound than both his friends and enemies have been willing to admit. Kenyatta has also been described as a talented orator, author, and editor. He had dictatorial and autocratic tendencies, as well as a fierce temper that could emerge as rage on occasion. Murray Brown noted that Kenyatta could be quite unscrupulous, even brutal in using others to get what he wanted, but he never displayed any physical cruelty or nihilism. Kenyatta had no racist impulses regarding white Europeans, as can, for instance, be seen through his marriage to a white English woman. He told his daughter the English are wonderful people to live with in England. He welcomed white support for his cause, so long as it was generous and unconditional, and spoke of a Kenya in which indigenous Africans, Europeans, Arabs, and Indians could all regard themselves as Kenyans, working and living alongside each other peacefully. Despite this, Kenyatta exhibited a general dislike of Indians, believing that they exploited indigenous Africans in Kenya. Kenyatta was a polygamist. He viewed monogamy through an anthropological lens as an interesting Western phenomenon but did not adopt the practice himself, instead having sexual relations with a wide range of women throughout his life. Murray Brown characterized Kenyatta as an affectionate father to his children, but one who was frequently absent. Kenyatta had 2 children from his first marriage with Grace Wahu, son Peter Muigai Kenyatta, born 1920, who later became a deputy minister, and daughter Margaret Kenyatta, born 1928. Margaret served as mayor of Nairobi between 1970 and 1976 and then as Kenya's ambassador to the United Nations from 1976 to 1986. Of these children, it was Margaret who was Kenyatta's closest confidant. During his trial, Kenyatta described himself as a Christian saying, "I do not follow any particular denomination. I believe in Christianity as a whole." Arnold stated that in England, Kenyatta's adherence to Christianity was desultory. While in London, Kenyatta had taken an interest in the atheist speakers at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park, while an Irish Muslim friend had unsuccessfully urged Kenyatta to convert to Islam. During his imprisonment, Kenyatta read up on Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism through books supplied to him by stock. The Israeli diplomat Asher Naim visited him in this period, noting that although Kenyatta was not a religious man, he was appreciative of the Bible. Despite portraying himself as a Christian, he found the attitudes of many European missionaries intolerable, in particular their readiness to see everything African as evil. In Facing Mount Kenya, he challenged the missionaries' dismissive attitude toward ancestor veneration, which he instead preferred to call ancestor communion. In that book's dedication, Kenyatta invoked ancestral spirits as part of the fight for African freedom. Within Kenya, Kenyatta came to be regarded as the father of the nation, and was given the unofficial title of Mzee, a Swahili term meaning grand old man. From 1963 until his death, a cult of personality surrounded him in the country, one which deliberately interlinked Kenyan nationalism with Kenyatta's own personality. This use of Kenyatta as a popular symbol of the nation itself was furthered by the similarities between their names. He came to be regarded as a father figure not only by Kikuyu and Kenyans, but by Africans more widely. After 1963, Malaba noted, Kenyatta became about the most admired post-independence African leader on the world stage, one who Western countries hailed as a beloved elder statesman. His opinions were most valued both by conservative African politicians and by Western leaders. On becoming Kenya's leader, his anti-communist positions gained favor in the West, and some pro-Western governments gave him awards. In 1965 he, for instance, received medals from both Pope Paul VI and from the South Korean government. In 1974, Arnold referred to Kenyatta as one of the outstanding African leaders now living, someone who had become synonymous with Kenya. He added that Kenyatta had been one of the shrewdest politicians on the continent, regarded as one of the great architects of African nationalist achievement since 1945. Kenneth Onyeangina characterized him as one of the greatest men of the 20th century, having been a beacon, a rallying point for suffering Kenyans to fight for their rights, justice, and freedom, whose brilliance gave strength and aspiration to people beyond the boundaries of Kenya. In 2018, Malaba described him as one of the legendary pioneers of modern African nationalism. In their examination of his writings, Berman and Lonsdale described him as a pioneer for being one of the first Kikuyu to write and publish. His representational achievement was unique. Thank you for watching this video.